Imagine sitting on a bus, hearing a stranger tell a kid he doesn't belong here. Would you speak up? Or would you sit there in silence like everyone else? The bus smelled like damp fabric and cheap cologne, the kind that lingered long after its wearer had stepped off. 17-year-old Keenan Wright barely noticed. His mind was still in the final moments of last period, replaying his teacher's words about an upcoming history project. He hated group work. It always ended the same way. He did the heavy lifting while his partners slacked off. As he adjusted his backpack and found his usual seat near the middle of the bus, he barely registered the woman a few rows ahead. Dorothy Lancaster, at least that's what the name on her leather purse said, sat stiffly, clutching the handles like the bus might suddenly tip over. She was the type of woman Keenan had learned to ignore. Older, tense, carrying herself like the world owed her something. The bus creaked forward, merging into traffic. A group of kids from a different high school laughed loudly near the back, their voices bouncing off the scratched-up windows. A man in a construction vest sat up front, tapping his knee to a beat only he could hear. Keenan pulled out his phone, hoping music would drown out everything. But before he could put in his earbuds, a sharp voice sliced through the chatter. "I don't know what this city's turning into." It wasn't directed at anyone in particular, but it was loud enough to make Keenan glance up. Dorothy was shaking her head, her lips pursed in disapproval. Her eyes flicked toward him for just a second before she looked away. Keenan had seen that look before. On teachers who expected less from him. On store clerks who watched him too closely. On neighbors who pretended not to see him when he walked by. He turned back to his phone. Not today. He wasn't about to let some bitter old woman ruin his ride home. But the thing about people like her, they don't stop at one comment. The bus rolled on, but the air inside felt different now, like something was about to break. The bus lurched forward at a red light, sending a ripple through the passengers. Keenan gripped the handle of his seat, steadying himself. He had almost convinced himself to ignore her, to let it roll off his back like he always did. But Dorothy wasn't finished. "This used to be a nice place," she muttered, louder this time. A few people glanced in her direction, then quickly looked away. No one wanted to get involved. Keenan stayed silent, hoping she would stop. She didn't. Kids these days have no respect. Coming in, taking over, acting like they own everything. Makes you wonder where they even came from. That was it. Keenan's fingers curled around his phone, his pulse kicking up a notch. His mother's voice echoed in his head. "Pick your battles, Keenan. Some fights aren't worth it. Maybe this was one of them. Maybe he should let her talk and keep his head down." But then she turned fully toward him, her eyes narrowing like she had finally decided who to aim her words at. "You don't belong here. Go back to Africa." The bus went dead silent. Keenan felt every pair of eyes shift in his direction. Some people looked uncomfortable, shifting in their seats, pretending to be absorbed in their phones. Others just watched, waiting to see what he'd do. The man in the construction vest up front stopped tapping his knee. Even the loud kids in the back had quieted. For a second, Keenan did nothing. He sat still, staring at the woman who had just flung those words at him like they were facts, like she had the right to decide where he belonged. A part of him wanted to laugh at how ridiculous she sounded, how tired and small her words felt. But another part of him burned. Not with anger, with something deeper. The kind of exhaustion that settles in when you've seen too much of this, lived too much of it. And still, people like her act like they're saying something new. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, as everyone waited for what would happen next. Keenan could feel the weight of every single stare pressing down on him. His hands clenched around his phone, but he forced himself to breathe, slow and steady. Dorothy's expression didn't waver. She sat there, shoulders squared, waiting for him to lash out, to give her an excuse to roll her eyes and say, "See? That's exactly what I mean." He wasn't going to give her that. But he also wasn't going to let it slide. A man near the front cleared his throat. No words, just a noise. The kind people make when they want to say something but don't want to get involved. A teenage girl near the back glanced at her friend, eyes wide. A woman in a navy blazer shifted uncomfortably, gripping the strap of her purse, and yet no one said anything. Keenan finally spoke. "What did you just say?" His voice was calm, steady, almost too steady. Dorothy scoffed, crossing her arms. "You heard me." Keenan leaned forward slightly, his eyes locked onto hers. "Yeah, I did. I just want to make sure you hear yourself." Her mouth pressed into a thin line. "I don't need to explain anything to you. You sure about that? Because right now, I think everyone here would love to know why you think you get to decide where I belong." A few heads turned back toward Dorothy. Someone near the front let out a quiet chuckle, quick, almost nervous. For the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed her face, just for a second. Then, just as quickly, it was gone. "People like you," she started, but Keenan cut her off. "People like me, what?" He let the words hang there, daring her to finish the sentence. Dorothy hesitated, and in that tiny pause, Keenan saw it. She wasn't expecting pushback. She wasn't expecting someone like him, a teenager, a kid in her eyes, to meet her words head on. But now, the entire bus was watching, waiting, and she wasn't as sure of herself anymore. Keenan could feel the shift happening, and he knew this wasn't just about him anymore. Keenan took a breath, steadying himself. He could feel the tension thick in the air, pressing in from all sides. Every person on that bus was waiting, eyes darting between him and Dorothy, uncertain of what would happen next. "You know what's funny?" Keenan said, his voice calm but firm. "You're sitting here telling me to go back to Africa, like this country doesn't belong to people like me. But tell me something. Where do you think you came from?" Dorothy's lips pursed, but she didn't speak. "You think your ancestors just sprouted out of the ground right here in America?" "Because they didn't. Just like mine didn't." A few murmurs rippled through the bus. Someone near the front nodded slightly, just enough for Keenan to notice. "The difference between you and me," he continued, leaning forward slightly. "My ancestors were brought here in chains. They weren't given a choice. But they built this country. Every brick, every road, every law that you take for granted, black hands helped make that happen." Dorothy let out a bitter laugh. "Oh, give me a break." "No," Keenan interrupted, his voice sharper now. "You don't get to brush it off. You don't get to act like history didn't happen just because it makes you uncomfortable." The bus was so silent now, Keenan could hear the faint hum of the engine beneath them. "The problem isn't that I don't belong here," he said, his voice softer now, but still unwavering. "The problem is that you don't know how to share a space that was never just yours to begin with." Dorothy's face twisted into something Keenan couldn't quite read. Anger? Embarrassment? He wasn't sure, but what he did know, she had nothing left to say. The silence wasn't just hers anymore. It belonged to everyone on that bus who had stayed quiet for too long. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, pressing against every corner of the bus. Dorothy's lips parted like she wanted to respond, to claw back some of the power she had just lost, but nothing came out. She had spent her whole life saying things like this, assuming no one would challenge her, but now, confronted with something she couldn't dismiss, she had nothing. Keenan didn't move. He didn't smirk. He didn't gloat. He just sat there, looking at her, waiting, and then someone spoke. "He's right." The voice came from the front, the man in the construction vest. His words weren't loud, but they were firm. Another voice, this time from the back. "Y'all ever notice how it's always the loudest ones who know the least?" A woman near the middle of the bus shook her head. "Tired of hearing this mess. Every time." Dorothy's shoulders tensed. She glanced around, realizing that the weight of the conversation had shifted. It was no longer just her and Keenan. Now the whole bus was in it. For the first time since she had spoken, Dorothy looked uncertain. She let out a scoff, shaking her head like she was dismissing the whole thing. But her voice was quieter when she muttered, "Unbelievable." Keenan could feel the energy shift again, this time lighter. The tension that had been thick enough to cut through was thinning. He turned back toward the window, staring out at the familiar streets rolling past. The bus felt different now, not because something massive had changed, but because something small had. Dorothy sat stiffly in her seat, staring ahead, her mouth set in a tight line. Maybe she would leave this bus and carry on exactly as she always had. Maybe she wouldn't. But everyone else? They had seen something. They had heard something. And maybe the next time they found themselves in a moment like this, they wouldn't stay silent. Keenan exhaled, feeling the weight lift just a little as the bus continued on its way. The bus rolled on, the city outside flickering past in bursts of movement, street signs, traffic lights, storefronts with flickering neon. Keenan sat back in his seat, letting his head rest against the window. His pulse had finally slowed, but he could still feel the lingering heat of the moment pressing against his skin. No one else spoke. Not to Dorothy. Not to him. But something had shifted. He could feel it. A few stops later, the man in the construction vest stood, gripping the rail as the bus slowed. Before stepping off, he glanced back at Keenan and gave him a small nod. One of those quick, quiet acknowledgements that said more than words ever could. As the doors hissed open and shut behind him, Keenan noticed the teenage girl near the back whispering to her friend. Her eyes flickered toward Dorothy before she muttered, "I hope I never end up like that." Dorothy didn't react, but her face had lost some of its certainty. Keenan turned away, not bothering to watch her anymore. He had said what he needed to say. Whether or not she learned something from it wasn't his responsibility. As the bus neared his stop, he grabbed his backpack and stood. He could feel eyes on him, some approving, some thoughtful, some simply unsure of what they had just witnessed. The doors groaned open, and as he stepped down onto the pavement, a woman's voice called out behind him, "Hey!" He turned back. It was the woman in the navy blazer. She looked at him for a moment, then gave a small, tight smile. "You handled that well." Keenan didn't answer right away. He just nodded. Not out of pride, not out of victory, but because in that moment he understood something. Today wasn't just about shutting one person down. It was about making people think. The bus pulled away, its engine fading into the background. Keenan exhaled, slinging his backpack over one shoulder as he started down the sidewalk. Tomorrow, the world would still be what it was. There would be more Dorothys, more moments like this. But today, on that bus, something had cracked open. And sometimes, that's how change starts, because silence keeps things the same. But speaking, that's how things begin to shift. If you made it this far, ask yourself, what would you have done? Would you have spoken up? Or would you have stayed silent, hoping someone else would handle it? Let's talk about it in the comments. And if this story made you think, share it, because conversations like these need to happen.